Okay.
Hi, Gary.
Sorry, somehow I got kicked out of my own meeting. Everything should be set up now. Perfect. Okay, now I'll share the screen. Sorry about that. A couple extra steps. Okay, so welcome to the latest meeting of ARRG. Today, it is my honor to host John Martin Fischer, who will be giving a talk called Rethinking the Free Will Debates. So for those of you who haven't been to one of these before, we had three meetings last fall. I've got three scheduled for this semester, one for this summer, which I'll talk about in a second, and a couple things that are tentatively in the works for the fall. In addition to these sort of individual talks, the goal is to give some sort of roundtable discussions. We'll hopefully do a mini workshop this summer. I haven't decided on the topic or the structure of that. I'd like to do more stuff on empirical work. The next talk by Corey Clark will talk about some of that stuff. And then there'll be some events aimed specifically at highlighting work by junior researchers, which I want to make sure is something we do here. And it's something that John did a great job of years ago when he started Garden of Working Paths. So all the events are hosted here synchronously, and they're also live streamed on YouTube. And then I record these talks and I post them on the ARG homepage and YouTube page. So in terms of what's coming up, Corey Clark, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, gives a talk in March. Dana Nelkin is giving a talk in April. There'll be a roundtable discussion on free will and science with Al Mealy, Eddie Namias, Adina Roskis, and John Dylan Haynes. We haven't figured out the dates because it's a little bit too soon to try to nail down a particular time. Kadri Vavellin has agreed to give a talk, which would be great. Hopefully we'll do that in the fall. Haven't set a date for that either. And then I think in December, there'll be a book symposium for Ann Whittle's book, Freedom and Responsibility, that'll include commentary by Barbara Vetter and Richard Feldman. So there's a lot of great stuff coming up. I'm super excited. I'm very thankful that so many great people are willing to participate and help me build this community. So that's what's coming up. Your audio is muted for the talk. Only I can unmute you. Here again, for those of you who were here last time, you know why this is new. This is a new feature. When the talk ends, if you have questions, please use the hand raise icon. At that point, I'll try to unmute everybody. If the speaker didn't have time to answer your question, please add it to the chat and I will make sure they receive it after the talk. I've done this for all the talks. So if you have a question that wasn't answered, just post it there and I'll be happy to make sure that the speaker gets it. So these things are recorded. Here again, they'll be on the ARG homepage. Those posts will serve as a discussion thread for people who missed the talk or who still have issues they'd like to discuss with one another. Everyone is welcome to participate in these threads. And the important thing is that speakers in no way agree to be on the hook for engaging with you in these threads. They've only volunteered very kindly to give their time to give these talks. I think some of them will be happy to participate in the threads, but it's certainly not something that I ask of them or expect of them. Okay, so let's get to today's talk. So Professor Fischer is one of only 22 university professors in the University of California 10-campus system, and he is the only philosopher to receive this honor. He is the author of The Metaphysics of Free Will, an essay on control, the author of Responsibility and Control, a Theory of Moral Responsibility with Mark Revisa. His more recent work includes a contribution to 4 Views on Free Will and 3 collections of essays with OUP, My Way, Essays on Moral Responsibility, Our Stories, Essays on Life, Death, and Free Will, and Deep Control, Essays on Free Will and Value. Most recently, Professor Fischer published, in terms of books, Death, Immortality, and Meaning in Life. looking at his CV is a good way of humbling yourself. I gave up on trying to count how many articles were included. Hundreds is like probably not an overestimation. It is awe-inspiring how much work he's managed to do. He's left an indelible imprint on the debate about free will. And for my purposes, before I turn it over to him, I just want to say that this group really wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for what he did for this community with Garden of Forking Paths in the early 2000s. At the time, I think that people didn't realize what could be accomplished with online research groups. And he set a trend, not just for the free will community, but for multiple communities. And at the time, as a grad student, it put me in touch with some of the leading figures in the field in a way that would have been impossible. And so I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to him as a scholar. And it's not just me. I think the whole community owes him a debt of gratitude. When the Garden of Forking Paths first closed, for understandable reasons, I started the Flickers of Freedom blog to try to carry that forward. For similar reasons to why Garden of Forking Paths closed, the Flickers of Freedom blog closed. And then I thought what happened with the pandemic gave me an opportunity to try to once again connect all the pieces and all the people that John had connected now almost 20 years ago. And so he really did, I think, an amazing thing for junior researchers in particular. And so I hope that the stuff that we're doing now can have the same impact on junior researchers that John had on me many moons ago when I was just getting started. So thanks again to him for being here. So that said, I'm going to close my slideshow. I'm going to quit sharing for now. I'm going to change the screen. I got to make sure I do all this out loud. And then I'm going to hopefully, so John, you should be able to now unmute.
Am I already unmuted? I think I am. Yep. Okay. And I can see a lot of you. I'm not sure if I can see everyone, but it is really nice to see all of you. First of all, thank you, Thomas, for that extremely kind introduction. I should point out that Neil Tognazzini and Gustavo Yarul, who was another grad student here at UCR, were also on the team that started the Garden of Forking Paths, so I'm very grateful to them. It was the usual project in which the professor got the credit, but the graduate students did all the work. So I really appreciated what they did. And it's just such a great thing to see how the community has grown up and developed. And from the ashes of the Flickers of Freedom has come this wonderful new venue. And thank you to Thomas very much. Thank you to all of you for coming. This is going to be a very informal talk. We have a lot of room for Q&A, though usually when I say that, I don't. So I'm going to really try and be disciplined about that. Also, it's going to leave a lot of loose ends. It's just kind of a programmatic, schematic presentation of some ideas, some of which I've already published. But I want to kind of give an overview of what I'm thinking. And also, I know that I'll be skating over issues about which there's a lot of disagreement. Many of you here will disagree with some of them, with a lot of what I say. And I'm not defending my views here, but I'm kind of laying them out. But of course, you can press me in the question period. For a long time, I've noticed something that struck me as interesting, a bit odd, and that is the parallel literatures about autonomy and moral responsibility in contemporary philosophy. There are just these two literatures on closely related freedom notions, autonomy and responsibility. And they don't communicate very much. They kind of go in parallel. The Frankfurt paper, the 1971 paper, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of the Person, introduced the hierarchical concept approach or interpretation of acting freely. And the 1970 article by Jerry Dworkin in News called Acting Freely introduced a hierarchical notion of autonomy. Although the article is called Acting Freely, his main interests are in paternalism and autonomy. And over the years, the debate kind of had a kind of isomorphic quality, because the hierarchical theories of both responsibility and autonomy were introduced, then objections to each, and then kind of new versions developed, and then objections. And many of the objections are the same, many of the new moves are the same, and it kind of intrigued me. I kind of wanted to know what was going on. I also noticed that in Harry Frankfurt, there was what I called a kind of mission creep, where he began by explicitly trying to make some progress in the metaphysical debates about the relationship between causal determinism and moral responsibility. In the 1969 paper on alternate possibilities and moral responsibility, which recently had its 50th birthday party, he was trying to argue that you could be morally responsible and free in a certain sense without having freedom to do otherwise, and therefore we can sidestep some of those traditional problems about determinism and free will. Now, and then in the concept of a person paper, he also is explicitly talking about the relationship between acting freely and causal determinism. And yet over time, suddenly he shifted to talking about autonomy, whereas the first papers were more, as it were, metaphysical. The later papers are more normative or ethical. I'm not sure he saw that this shift was taking place. Other people, Ben Mitchell-Yellen, has tried to convince me that these two ideas were always in Frankfurt from the very beginning, and maybe that's right. But they are two different freedom notions. And there's been a kind of mission creep, at least in Frankfurt's work, I think. All right. What I want to say is moral responsibility, authenticity, and autonomy are themselves not kinds of freedom, but they implicate or piggyback on notions of freedom, and they're interestingly similar but distinct kinds of freedom. I have a few notes here that I'm referring to, but I'll try not to read them. I think it's helpful to distinguish the concept of, let's say, moral responsibility, or the different notions, autonomy, responsibility, and authenticity, from their conditions of application, kind of in a pre-Quinian approach. So I go back and forth between the concept and the nature or essence, as opposed to the conditions of application. And, it's so controversial, and many of you have made important contributions to the question of what the concept of moral responsibility is. I like the Peter Strawson account, according to which moral responsibility is aptness to the reactive attitudes and certain related activities, such as moral praise and blame. Moral praise and blame, and punishment and reward. And punishment, where you think of punishment as a symbolic expression of some of the negative reactive attitudes, such as resentment and indignation. And I use the term aptness as a kind of umbrella term, which under which notions like desert or fittingness can fit. I remember once Michael McKenna, we talked a lot about these issues, and he called me and he said, "What do you think? Is it desert or fittingness?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't know. I've never even thought about that." I use the term aptness as this umbrella term, and I think people have convinced me that maybe there are important differences, but I don't really have a dog in that race. So aptness is my umbrella term for the reactive attitudes and associated activities. I should also point out that there's been a tremendous amount of interesting literature looking more carefully at the concept of responsibility and distinguishing. Gary Watson, I think, is here, and his pioneering article, Two Faces of Responsibility, distinguished between attributability and accountability responsibility. And David Shoemaker kind of ran with that and gave an even more ramified taxonomy. And there's all sorts of really good work that I'm just going to kind of put aside for the purposes of this talk, but it is important. I'm just, okay. So that to me, the concept of responsibility is the concept of being an apt candidate for the reactive attitudes. The concept of, well, and etymologically, responsibility is responsibility. Etymologically, autonomy is setting the law for yourself. And that's the concept of autonomy, is governance by the self. Although moral responsibility is self-governance in a sense, my point, and sometimes it's difficult to articulate it more specifically, is that autonomy is governed by a stronger notion of the self than responsibility. Sometimes I'll call it the ideal self. Now, I should just say, when I use these terms like self, I'm not reifying. I'm not thinking of them as things, but as perhaps networks of motivational states or subsets of your desires, beliefs, acceptances of values. I'm not reifying them. Okay. So, as I say, I believe autonomy requires governance by a stronger notion of the self, or a more demanding, more robust notion of the self. And one of, I think various people have noticed something like this distinction, but the one person who's most closest to the way I look at it is Agnieszka Jaworska, my colleague here at UCR, though we developed these ideas totally independently. And Agnieszka talks about two different kinds of identification, a weaker and a more robust kind of identification that basically yield roughly the two notions I'm talking about, responsibility and autonomy. So we're kind of on the same page there. Okay. So roughly, what I want to simply put, I probably should have shared screen, but I always screw up when I try and share screen. So here, simply put, moral responsibility is governance by the self, or perhaps the internal self. I'll go back and forth, because in identifying with a first order desire by forming a second order volition, Frankfurt thinks that renders the first order desire internal in a certain sense. And I think Gary Watson thinks of the evaluational desires, or the outputs of the evaluational system, as the internal motivational states, though he can correct me if I'm wrong. So it's the internal self, but not the ideal self. So responsibility is governed by the internal self. Autonomy is governance by the ideal self. And I'm just going to make a suggestion here that will need further defense. And I would ask you to reflect on it, but I'm not going to be able to defend it in any detail here. Authenticity, I think, is governance by the real self, creating a pattern over the relevant period of time, where that period of time is going to be context dependent. One thing that's important to me is try to develop accounts of these three freedom implicating notions that build on a core idea, and kind of add modifications, but show how they're all similar in sharing this core element, but also interestingly different. So what is this self-governance? Well, you might not be surprised that I think of it in terms of guidance control. I think that, so now the conditions of application, I think of acting freely as acting from your own reasons responsive mechanism. So owned reason sensitivity of a certain sort. And I think guidance control is the only freedom required for moral responsibility. There's a freedom requirement and an epistemic requirement. So I do not think alternative possibilities are required for moral responsibility. I know that many of you disagree with me, and I'm not going to try and defend that here. I mean, you can ask me afterwards, but it doesn't seem like quite the right place to do it. I will totally concede that I haven't, and I don't think anyone has provided a decisive defense of that interpretation of the moral of the Frankfurt cases or any other argumentation. It's not decisive, but I find it plausible, and I'm going to just run with it for the purposes of this talk. Again, I'm not reifying mechanisms. It's been kind of an easy critique of my view. When he talks about a mechanism, he's reifying it, and so then they can dismiss the entire view. So I ask you, don't dismiss it on that basis. You could dismiss it for some other reason. Okay, so it's a process or a way, not a thing. So the way I would put it is when I'm morally responsible, I do it my way. I own the mechanism. All right, so responsibility is guidance controlled by the self. Autonomy is guidance controlled by the agent's ideal self. Now, in my view, that requires both a positive and a negative condition. The positive condition posits the individual's identification with an action in the sense that she deems it defensible, all things considered. Defensible, all things considered, considering your life as a whole, where all things considered includes at least moral reasons and prudential reasons. I'm kind of following in Gary Watson's steps here. Let me quote, I have a quote from Gary in his classic paper, Free Agency. He's talking about what a value is, although it's a pretty brief characterization. He says, we might say that an agent's values consist in those principles and ends which he, in a cool and non-self-deceptive moment, articulates as definitive of the good, fulfilling, and defensible life. So my notion of the ideal self, the positive component of the ideal self, is quite similar to Gary's idea of a value, something that's defensible as the best course of action, considering all things, including moral and prudential reasons. And then the negative condition implies that no one else or external condition renders it unreasonable to expect the individual to do otherwise. Okay, this is following closely Philip Pettit's interesting idea of non-domination. When you're dominated by someone else, you're not autonomous. So this is my negative or non-denominational, not non-denominational, but sorry, a religious notion creeping it, but non-domination. It's a negative condition. So that's positive and negative. That shows how more robust autonomy is. The metaphor for autonomy is Isaiah Berlin's notion of the inner citadels. It's this powerful, protected, it's powerful in the positive sense, and it's protected in the negative sense by a moat, basically. Now, interestingly, the metaphor for moral responsibility that also was suggested by Gary Watson and further developed by others is a conversation. So in a conversation, again, responsibility, you're enmeshed and connected. In being in the inner citadel, you're separate, you're independent, okay? You're not connected in quite that way. Okay, so before I gave you the three characterizations, and let me see, how am I doing on time? Okay, I gave you the three characterizations just using governance, but now I think that's the concept. But I think when you try and fill in the conditions, you can fill them in a little more. So moral responsibility is guidance control by the internal self. Autonomy is guidance control by the ideal self. And authenticity is guidance control by the real self, i.e., by the internal self, insofar as it creates a pattern over a context-sensitive period of time. The real self is the the pattern is a recognizably coherent and appropriately temporally extended self. Okay, so authenticity, I'm tempted to say it's in between responsibility and autonomy, but that might not quite be the way of thinking about it, because it does not invoke autonomy. I mean, the ideal self, it invokes the real self. I mean, sorry, well, the real self, but it's the real self because it's the morally responsible self, the internal self, but insofar as it exhibits a pattern over some appropriate length of time, and that length of time can't be specified algorithmically apart from looking at a particular context. I don't know if this is a metaphor, but we sometimes say that's the real John, let's say. That's the real John. And usually, I think that's saying that's the authentic John. And that is not a John that just pops up. It's a John that's consistent with a pattern of morally responsible action. At least that's the way I think of it. Now, I admit that this is oversimplified and that each of these notions perhaps needs additional elements. I'm just trying to give you what I think are the core elements, and the basic element is guidance control, but then there are the guidance control plays a slightly different role in the specification of each of these notions. I hope that they at least show a kind of direction I want to go in analyzing. And of course, autonomy, there's a huge literature on each of these. And in fact, there's a literature on the social nature of moral responsibility. And it's interesting. I've been reading some of that. I'm more inclined to think of those conditions as pertinent to autonomy than moral responsibility. But there's a huge literature also on autonomy and conditions that you have to add in. But these are my kind of abstract core conditions. Now, I kind of want to see where you can get with this, because that's the main thing here. First of all, the very famous and important debate between Frankfurt and Watson. And Frankfurt on the hierarchical theory, and I won't go through it because I'm sure almost everyone, if not everyone, is familiar, but Frankfurt said in his original 1971 paper that it's a sufficient condition for identifying with a first order desire that you form a second order desire to act on that first order, a second order volition. That's sufficient. And what Gary Watson pointed out is, basically, why stop there? If the first order desire is not enough to make your action a free action or make it the case that you're acting freely, why does just adding another level, kind of by alchemy, transform it into acting freely? And then you might, and you might ask, where do you stop? You can't just posit that individuals have an indefinitely or infinitely large number of higher and higher order desires. That's implausible. And if you stop at one point, it seems arbitrary. And so famous critique by Gary, he also worried that a mere desire is too thin a reed to get to moral responsibility. You need something more substantive. And there's been a huge debate about the regress argument. And Harry Frankfurt, I believe he took Gary's critique to heart. He agreed with it. And then he said, no, we have to add these other dimensions. And he wrote identification and wholeheartedness. And then there were further critiques of that. And then he wrote various articles in which he tried to answer this deep challenge by Gary Watson in different ways. My own view is he should have stopped, shouldn't have gone down this path at all. He should have just said, with regard to the regress argument, all the freedom you need is a mesh or a match between your second order volition and your will. That's it, no higher desires, because now, this is assuming that the manipulation problem has been solved, because that's another worry for these theories. We're just putting that aside and we're focusing on the regress problem. Everybody has thought, even Frankfurt, that you have to, you can't just stick with that second order volition matching of your will. But I think he should have stuck there, because it's what distinguishes us from animals. We can step back and form preferences about our first order preferences. And when you do select, when you do form a second order volition to act in accordance with one of your first order desires, you're acting from a capacity to step back and select your will, to select the first order desire that you want to act on. And to me, that makes you responsible for it. You can be blameworthy for selecting that desire. Now, what I think is going on is the view that you have to add further conditions is really a view about autonomy, because I don't think you're autonomous simply in virtue of a conformity between your second order volition and your will. I think that's, though, about autonomy, not about responsibility. So I think that debate, and it's a huge debate, can perhaps at least be illuminated, or at least I commend to you thinking about the possibility that Frankfurt, and that one could just stick with the simple mesh between the second order volition and the first order desire with regard to moral responsibility. Okay, that's all the freedom you need, given that the manipulation condition has been. But these other conditions are all about autonomy. And you see, as the literature goes by, goes on, like I said, there's a mission creep. They're not anymore talking about just a kind of freedom that could be plugged in to a solution, to a compatibilist solution to the great traditional debates. They're now talking about something normative, something like autonomy. Okay, so I also think that the distinction between responsibility and autonomy can illuminate and perhaps solve problems about manipulation. The manipulation arguments have kind of come into center stage recently, although they've been around for a long time, even in contemporary philosophy. They go back really to the Greeks and the gods kind of possessing, in a clandestine way, possessing people, causing mania, causing people to act in ways they otherwise wouldn't have. Bernard Williams talks about these cases in his great book, what is it, Shame and Necessity, or something like that. There's been a lot of interest in contemporary philosophy, but I think recently, Al Mealy and Dirk Pereboom have sharpened the worries by their thought experiments. They're very nice, gripping, and illuminating thought experiments. So I commend both Al and Dirk. And the one that Al developed is the zygote argument. And again, you're probably all familiar with it, but it's a case in which a goddess, Diana, knows that the world is deterministic, and for some reason she wants an individual to commit a murder, I think it is. You know, I may not have all the details right, but to do something bad 30 years down the road. So she constructs his zygote such that, knowing the laws of nature and so forth, he will then grow up into someone who will commit this murder 30 years down the road. And that's an initial design version of what might be broadly called manipulation cases, an initial design version, because it's not hand-on manipulation. But then Dirk Pereboom has his famous four-stage argument. And let me see if I get the stages right. In the first stage, there is, unbeknownst to the agent, direct manipulation of her brain, let's say it's a she, and perhaps the manipulation enhances or strengthens an already a tendency toward egoism that the agent already had, but it, unbeknownst to the agent, strengthens it in such a way that she goes ahead and does the egoistic thing. In the second case, scientists have pre-programmed the individual so that she'll do just the same sort of thing down the road in a deterministic way. And in the third case, the individual has a very rigorous child upbringing by, let's say, some fundamentalist parents. And I mean rigorous, I mean hard. I don't mean the child is learning the predicate calculus. So anyway, a very hard childhood upbringing such that the same configuration of mental states that were there in the first two cases are there, and it's determined that the individual does what they do. And in the last case, it's just an ordinary, nothing special case of causal determination. And Dirk's intuition is the individual who's manipulated in the first case is not morally responsible, and there's no difference between any of the cases. So you should conclude no responsibility in the last one. Something similar going on in the initial design case. All the versions of that case, and in particular, the very nice version by Al-Mili, you start with what I call the intuition eliciting thought experiment. So Diana, and you say, no responsibility. In Ernie down the road, no responsibility. That's the thought experiment. And then the no difference premise, there's no difference between that and an ordinary case of causal determination. And then conclusion, we're not morally responsible in an ordinary situation of causal determinism. So that's the way the arguments work. And I don't have, let's see, I really want to leave for a lot of time for Q&A. So I'm just going to say, I think the key is to distinguish autonomy from responsibility. I've argued this at some length in different papers, but in the initial design case, Ernie is not autonomous, but he is morally responsible. He's not autonomous because the second condition is not met. He's dominated by Diana. But now you can't say there's, but I believe he is morally responsible. So there's no difference with regard to moral responsibility, and he is morally responsible. So I think what's crucial here is to separate out our intuitions about autonomy, which involves this stronger positive condition and a negative condition, from our intuitions about responsibility. Ernie is responsible, at least I think he is. And if he weren't responsible, then his responsibility would not supervene on his entire life. Something prior to his life, Diana's intentions would make a difference. Now, of course, let me just say, sometimes something that happens before you were born affects you, like fetal alcohol syndrome and so forth. But what we're talking about is two individuals who are exactly the same throughout their lives, one of whom was set up that way by Diana for her particular purposes, one of whom was not. I just find it really implausible that the first one, is not responsible, simply because someone before he was even born set him up like that. Anyway, I would also say about Dirk's case, my view is no responsibility in the first case because the individual is not acting from their own appropriately reasons responsive mechanism. It's the scientist, it's a manipulation mechanism. but there's a crucial difference then between that and the rest of the cases. So no responsibility in the first case, but the no difference principle is now going to be false with regard to moral responsibility. You might be confusing autonomy and moral responsibility, and therefore, well, I got lost here. What I wrote down is that if you start with case one, okay, and there's no moral responsibility, but then when you switch to autonomy, you get to a problematic conclusion. I would say that all of the cases are no autonomy cases, okay? But the first case is no responsibility and no autonomy, but the rest are responsibility cases. And you could get confused about that unless you separate autonomy and responsibility. Sorry, I didn't do that very well, but okay, some other applications. So I think it can be applied to the zygote argument, to the four-case argument. What I want to say is God's foreknowledge and causal determinism are not going to be compatible with autonomy because they don't meet the negative condition. Something outside of themselves, something external to themselves and out of their control is sufficient for their choices and actions. So they're not autonomous, but they can be, individuals can be morally responsible. So determinism is compatible with responsibility. God's foreknowledge is compatible with responsibility. But those two doctrines, determinism and God's foreknowledge, rule out autonomy. So there's this asymmetry there. And I think if you consider the ultimacy or sourcehood condition for for moral responsibility, this is the idea that if we are responsibility, there can't be a source or a determining factor or a sufficient condition, perhaps, entirely outside of us or prior to our birth, let's say, that issues in our choices and actions in our lives, we have to be the source of our actions, can't be outside of ourselves. You see that in libertarians like Robert Cain, who believes in an ultimacy condition, but the ultimacy condition requires causal indeterminacy. You see it, I think, in Dirk Pereboom, who is a source incompatibilist because he believes, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, that you can't have responsibility where you have an external sufficient condition that determines your choices and actions. You have to be the source of your actions in a strong sense. That's a view that I sketched as a possibility in my first published paper on these topics, responsibility and control. I said, even if the Frankfurt cases show that responsibility doesn't require alternative possibilities, that still leaves it open that determinism rules out responsibility in virtue of something about the actual sequence. And I did not come up with the term source incompatibilism. That's something that came later, but I at least mapped that as a possibility. And Galen Strawson, of course, emphasizes the importance of sourcehood in a strong sense. I mean, he's an incompatibilist, but he's also, I think, an impossibilist. He's not just an incompatibilist. So perhaps you're going to predict what I'm going to say is those arguments are about autonomy, but not about responsibility. And when you really look at the motivations that are offered for all of these arguments, they're really in terms of this strong requirement of identification. Okay, I think I'm going to stop in a minute or so. Um, I just want to say, I think, and this is going to be an obnoxious way of putting it, that libertarianism doesn't exist. But a less obnoxious and more accurate way is to say, the arguments typically made for intuitions, I mean, for libertarians, and the intuitions that are invoked pertain more to autonomy. So it's really a view about autonomy rather than a view about a particular position in the traditional debates about the relationship between determinism, freedom, and responsibility. It's more about autonomy. So I guess the position exists, but not within the lattice or the framework of positions in the classical debates. Finally, I just wanted to talk, this is really programmatic at this point, but people in talking about paternalism, and let's say paternalistic restrictions on the information patients get or on the kinds of decisions they can make, or restrictions on self-harming behavior or risky behavior, you know, perhaps contracts for slavery or physician-assisted suicide. In the biomedical ethics literature, it's all about autonomy. You have to figure out, is someone autonomous? And often there's a requirement of a waiting period, but of course the waiting period is going to be longer with regard to suicide than it is going to be or for something else. But I think it's misleading to talk about autonomy. I think that we should be thinking about authenticity. It has to be an authentic choice. First of all, let's say I choose physician-assisted suicide, but I don't think it is defensible in terms of all things, and in terms of all the reasons. I don't think, for instance, it's morally justified, but I do think it's prudentially justified. So in my view, I freely choose physician-assisted suicide. It's my internal self that's governing me by a reasons responsive mechanism. I don't think it would be right to say, I mean, I'm quite libertarian, you know, not in the metaphysical sense, but I have libertarian intuitions normatively about these cases. I mean, if I choose that, even though I feel it wouldn't be morally justified, but it's what I perhaps aesthetically or in terms of my self-interest, I wish to do, and I choose it, and as a result of a reasons responsive mechanism, I think that is all you need. It would not be appropriate to demand autonomy. But then the waiting periods are important, because the waiting periods, in my view, are not just epistemic. In other words, you're not just waiting to make sure that was the agent's responsible choice. That would be one way of putting it, but I think upon reflection, it's better to think of it in terms of looking for authenticity, where authenticity requires guidance control by the self, the internal self, not autonomy, but in a way that creates a pattern over time. So it's not the case that a week later I choose not to have physician, and then a week later I say, okay, yes, or that kind of weird pattern. What we want to do is make sure that the agent's choice is authentic. So the issue is not whether it's really a morally responsible choice. The question is whether it's a choice by the real self. And I think there's some subtle differences that get ignored in the paternalism literature. Okay, so I repeat, this is very programmatic. And I've said things that I haven't defended. And it's just I'm just commending to you that this might be a different way of thinking about things, a different way that might make some progress. I like to do philosophy in the way Robert Nozick recommended, and that is providing philosophical explanations, not necessarily decisive arguments from premises to conclusions, but rather, let's consider this idea and let's see how fruitful it is, and see how it connects different issues. And I guess what I've done today is an example of that. So, okay, I'll stop now. Thank you. So how do we do this, Tom?
Thank you. I'll do it.
Okay.
I'll as soon as I'm gonna switch to the gallery view. Just give me 1 sec on my end, so they get a different recording. There are a ton of hands, so I'm just gonna work my way around the queue in terms of hands. I will let me unmute. Let me make it so people can unmute themselves, assuming we're past the point where you're going to do something inappropriate. I think those people have already left. I hope. If you're still here, I don't mind you being inappropriate, because that's pretty impressive. Your stick-to-itiveness is the gumption required would be impressive. So okay, so Daniel is at least on my screen the first up. So we'll do Daniel Cohen, and you should be, like I said, you should be able to unmute yourself, Daniel. Dan, yeah.
Great, thank you, and thank you, John, for your excellent paper. So I just want to see if I understand the paper, one of your points correctly, and also to put pressure on it. So it sounds like you're endorsing Frankfurt's 1971 view about the conditions for moral responsibility, so that it's a necessary and sufficient condition for a person to be morally responsible, which you take to be that they're apt to the reactive attitudes. And it's that the conditions, the necessary and sufficient conditions, are that they act on desires that they endorse, that they desire, that they are most strongly motivated in that way. So I suppose that maybe I'll just pause for a second. Am I correct in interpreting what you're saying?
It's not quite correct, but it's my fault that it isn't. What I really want to say is, if you adopt the hierarchical framework like Frankfurt does, and like a bunch of other people do, then you should stop at the second level. I myself don't buy into the hierarchical framework, so I should have been more careful about that. No, I believe I don't accept Frankfurt's analysis of acting freely in terms of second order volitions matching your first order desire. All I'm saying is that if you accept something like that hierarchical picture, then you should stop at the second level with regard to acting freely and moral responsibility. Okay, so I mean, I think guidance control is the freedom component of moral responsibility. So acting from your own appropriately reasons responsive mechanisms, that not acting from a second order volition. Okay.
Okay. Right, so it's not a departure from your original views. Okay, then I'll shift to a slightly different question to the one I wanted to ask then. So insofar as you're guided by reasons responsive mechanisms, this sounds in the ballpark of autonomy, because if you kind of unpack the reasons responsiveness stuff, so you talked about autonomy as talking about you're identifying with your motivations as best, all things considered. Maybe that's a bit stronger than reasons responsiveness, but there is that evaluative component that's part of the conditions for responsibility. Is that right? So
very good. Yeah. Again, they are in the ballpark. All three of these notions. One of my points is they're all in the ballpark, and they might even be sitting very close to each other, but in slightly different seats. And so one way in which one can distinguish them is you can act in a weak-willed way. You can freely act against your best judgment or your all things considered judgment and be morally responsible, but that's not consistent with autonomy in my view. Okay, right. So yeah, it's a stronger notion of reasons conformity. I mean, you don't have to conform to your strongest reason or your judged to be all things considered defensible reason in order to be morally responsible. Otherwise, there wouldn't be weakness will, there wouldn't be knowing evil. But those are inconsistent with autonomy in my view.
Yeah, that really clarifies. Thank you. So autonomy is like strong reasons responsiveness, perhaps. as you put in your
Yes,
book.
yeah, strong
Yeah.
reasons rather than moderate. Good, thank you. And these are great questions that were reasonable to ask because I was very quick and not very good at explaining my view. So, okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Dirk.
So in the account you set out, the the self or the agent has a central role in your account of moral responsibility, authenticity, and autonomy. And you mentioned in your talk that there are people out there such as Carolina Sartorio and Michael McKenna who criticize your 1994-1998 view on the grounds that it's a mechanism focused to you and not an agent focused to you. And if I'm not mistaken, you suggested that they're kind of missing the mark in that criticism. I'm wondering if you'd expand on that. So you don't see that, I take it you don't see that the self or agent focused view that you set out just now is really opposed to the mechanism centered view that you developed in the 90s.
Yes, absolutely. There have been a number of people who've criticized my idea that the basic phenomenon is the responsiveness of the mechanism that issues in your act. Again, where that's not reified. They think one should focus on the reasons responsiveness of the agent. And simply put, I think the agent is reasons responsive in virtue of something more basic, perhaps analytically more basic, and that is the responsiveness of the mechanism. So my view is like, and so McKenna, Sartorio, and actually Dana Nelkin and David Brink in a new book. And, I think it's all, okay, and this may not be the kindest way of putting it, but it's much ado about not very much, because I can say that the agent is reasons responsive. It's just in virtue of that property, certain properties of sensitivity of the mechanism. So think of reliabilist accounts of knowledge or tracking truth accounts of knowledge. You say, and they are mechanism relativized, the mechanism has to be reliable. And in Nozick's version, the mechanism has to track truth. And it's in virtue of those that an agent knows, okay? The agent himself or herself or themselves know, okay, but it's in virtue of this property of what might be called a part of them or a subsystem of them. So I still think an agent guides or governs their actions, but it's in virtue of properties of their mechanism. So, I really, now maybe, all those people, McKenna and Nelkin and Brink and Sartorio are very sophisticated, insightful philosophers, and maybe they can convince me in the end that it's better to just have an agent-based approach. But so far, I haven't been convinced. Let me say one more thing. Intuitively, to me, in the Frankfurt cases, the agent's not responsive to reasons. The agent couldn't respond to reasons, because if they were about to choose and do otherwise, the counterfactual intervener would have triggered the chip in the brain. The agent couldn't have done otherwise. The agent wasn't responsive to reasons, but the actual sequence mechanism is. Now, in the end, my view is you could go either way. You could, doesn't really matter. You could just, as long as you're clear about your analytic path, you could either have a mechanism-based theory or an agent-based theory. But the point is, a mechanism-based theory posits that the sensitivity properties or profile of the mechanism is basic, and then but it's in virtue of that the agent has those properties. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, good. Randy, you're up.
Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure this question's on target. I wonder, so whether you intended to give sort of a comprehensive view of the free will issues. If that was the goal, then I was surprised that the ability to do otherwise didn't appear in the list. I mean, I'm inclined to think that that is part of the problem. It's been a part of the problem for centuries, and I think it arises at least in this way, that it's just so an aspect of the ordinary human experience of agency that is very pronounced when we're deliberating about what to do, that we take it for granted that there are two or maybe more than two incompatible things that are open to us, and it's up to us which of those we pursue. And that raises issues that, so I mean, that encompasses the idea that often when we act, we were able to act otherwise. And so, I mean, that arises as an aspect of the problem, independently of whether it's connected to responsibility or autonomy or authenticity. Anyway, so I wonder whether you didn't mean to deny any of that, or whether you disagree with that.
Okay, again, great question. And when I selected the title, Rethinking Free Will Debates, I kind of felt slightly guilty, and I realized what it should have been was rethinking to some extent some of the free will debates. But I figured that is not a very catchy title and no one would come. So I tricked you into coming by making it a more exciting title than it is. Or than
Oh, no, I would have come anyway.
Well, thank you. Yes, I agree that our view of ourselves as having at various points in our lives freedom to choose this path or that path, that the future is a garden of working paths. That's an important part of the way we conceptualize ourselves and our deliberation and our moral responsibility. So both the forward-looking and backward-looking parts of agency, a crucial part of the common sense and more reflective in legal theory, for instance, ways of thinking about these issues includes freedom to do otherwise, alternative possibilities. So someone's morally responsible only if he had or she had a fair opportunity to do otherwise. So they didn't have to do what they did. I'm deliberating about options that I think are within my power. So yes, a full, and this wasn't supposed to be comprehensive, it was supposed to just say, okay, assuming that you can recast those aspects, those forward-looking and backward-looking aspects of our ways of thinking about responsibility in an actual sequence way, then how could we use a core idea of freedom to illuminate debates about, these different debates? Now, as you know, I'm very, very concerned about the classical arguments for the incompatibility of God's foreknowledge and freedom to do otherwise, and causal determinism and freedom to other. I try to address them, and I try and defend the Frankfurt cases as a way to sidestep them. But the honest thing to say is, I don't think there is a decisive argument in favor of the views I take. So let me just say, of course, the way I want to rethink these issues is you're morally responsible if you acted freely in doing what you did. It's not required that you could have done otherwise. And we deliberate over the space of epistemic possibilities. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what's best, all things considered, among the options that, for all I know, I can do. But it might be that in the end, my choice is the only choice I could have made. It's just that, and I might even know that it will be the only choice I can make. But if I don't know what specifically it will be, I can still deliberate. There can still be a point. So I want to recast a more comprehensive approach would recast both deliberation and moral responsibility in terms of actual sequence notions. But I totally agree that that's a radical departure from common sense and reflection. Radical departure. That's why the theory is so interesting in my view, but thank you for the question. All of these just show that I was not careful enough and thorough enough.
No, it's just that it was interesting. That's all it shows. Okay, so Reza.
It's compatible, both of them. Okay.
Thank you. So I think it's a question of clarification. I just think I got a little confused about the relationship between responsibility and autonomy. So I can see that conditions for realizing responsibility are different from conditions for realizing autonomy. But maybe I just read too much Kant, but I have this kind of intuition that the possibility of autonomy, the possibility of being an autonomous agent is required for responsibility. So it's not, the cases of like Derek's cases seems to be cases that it's not just that the agent happens to be not autonomous. It's just as far as the agent can do things, it cannot be autonomous. And that seems to undermine the responsibility kind of intuition that I had.
Good. Okay. So yeah, I switch things around. It's not that responsibility requires autonomy, but on my view, autonomy requires responsibility, but autonomy is something more. And at least Kant and I would agree that autonomy is not consistent with causal determinism. The phenomenal world gives you only heteronymous action, not autonomous action. And so I agree with that. If causal determinism is true, we wouldn't be autonomous, we wouldn't be self-governed. We would be dominated, not by someone else, but by nature, let's say, or external factors out of our control. So that's what I would say. My view kind of fits with that Kantian position, but his theory is so complex, and I'm not a good exegete of it, so I'm not sure that I have much more that would really be illuminating. It might partly be a kind of terminological dispute, but I mean, if you say more to press me, that's fine. But I just am not as sensitive and good in exegete of Kant. So.
Just maybe a quick follow-up, if that's okay. So I mean, we can put Kant aside. Just the thought that to take the agents to be reason responsive, we have to be able to make sense of agent as being able to respond well, or response in the all things considered case. And the problem with some of those cases seems to be that we are thinking of an agent who can respond but can't respond well because autonomy is undermined. And so it seems like if that's not a possibility, responding well is not a possibility, then we're not really making sense of agent as responding to reasons.
See, in my view, when you're responsible, you act from a certain kind of capacity, the capacity for reasons responsiveness, and you therefore, because I think you need certain patterns in the receptivity of reasons, and reactivity is all of the piece, so that if that mechanism is operating, if you can react to one reason, you can react to another. That's all a little bit controversial, but what I want to say is someone who's reasons responsive, as it were, can react to the best reason, let's say. He can react well, but might not, okay? So that's the way I would put it. So in the Kantian idea, you act you may not act in accordance with the categorical imperative, but when you act rationally, you act with the capacity to conform to the categorical imperative. So when you act from a reasons responsive mechanism, you act from the capacity to respond to the reason if there is a sufficient reason to do otherwise. But you don't have to have the power to do otherwise. It's just this, your capacity has to be responsive. So, okay, thank you. Thank you for the question.
So, all right, sorry about that. Dave, you're up.
Hey, John, it's great to see you. Great to hear you. Thanks again, as always,
Thank
Thomas,
you.
for arranging this. I wanted to ask you, John, about just really an invitation to say more about authenticity, in particular, its relation to guidance and freedom. I think there's a really powerful, natural understanding of authenticity that connects up to what you said. It's a kind of reflection of your real self, who you really are. And moral psychologists and empirical psychologists have been studying this idea of what they're thinking of as authenticity, and they're asking people, do various desires, attitudes, and beliefs, and so forth, do they reflect who you are deep down inside? That's the kind of phrasing that they're using. And it's a really familiar notion, but it doesn't seem to me so well or very clearly sometimes with the understanding of guidance and freedom, and a kind of classic case to get your head around here of authenticity. They'll ask a case of someone, say, I've been raised in a deeply religious, isolated community, taught to believe that same-sex desires are deeply immoral, and I nevertheless find myself having these kinds of desires. I totally reject them. I evaluate them as horrifyingly bad and wrong. And so, but the question is, do they reflect who I am deep down inside? Yes, these seem to be, many people say, these are the authentic desires that I have. And it's not clear the connection that's going to have to guidance or freedom, I think. And so I'm just curious to hear more about what you're thinking of in terms of authenticity. Are you, is it kind of a term of art here where there is an attachment of guidance and it does reflect who the deep self really is, and there's not these kinds of cases of deep self-deception and so forth? Or do you want to include these kinds of cases as under the rubric of authenticity?
Excellent. And I'm not sure what to say because I don't have a very firm grasp of authenticity. It's really, to me, the most difficult of the three, the triplets. There's always a difficult child. So I was actually thinking of authentic choices and authentic actions. Wasn't thinking so much of authentic desires, and kind of inferring from a recurrent pattern of desires that's what that reflects who the agent really is, despite perhaps their attempts to not act on those desires or to repress them. And so I'll have to think more about that. I don't know what to say. I'm not sure what it means to say that's who, let's say it's a he, that's who he is deep down inside. I'm not sure that the psychoanalytic account of what our true selves are or who we really are is the most illuminating or the most accurate or the most helpful. And I'm not sure what that metaphor of depth is, but I do think, so we would, but it's complicated. Let's say I have, hypothetically, I have recurrent homosexual desires, imagery, fantasy, but I never choose to act on it. I never do. I think of myself as heterosexual. I think this probably happens more often than we think, but I'm in denial now. And if one night I go secretly to a gay bar, would you say, yeah, that's the real John? That's really who John is. I'm not sure, because it's just the first time I've ever done that. Why isn't part of who I'm really, I really am, my suppression for whatever reason? Maybe I think it's morally wrong. Maybe I think it would hurt my family. Maybe I think I don't want to do something to alienate myself from my religious tradition that's very important to me. So why exactly are the desires the real me? I'm not sure. But it's a great question. And, it just raises the point that I'm going to have to think much more about authenticity and what role it plays in our actual, our lives and our attributions.
Robin, sorry, it took me a second to unmute myself.
That's okay. I'm going to ask my question quickly because I have to do something at 8:30, but I think I'll make it. I had a question related to, I think, to Reza's question about responsibility and autonomy. So you made this distinction between responsibility and autonomy, and then you kind of responded to the Ernie case and the Ford case by saying, well, Ernie's responsible, but he's not autonomous. In case 1, we don't have responsibility or autonomy, but in case 2 and 3, we've got responsibility. I was wondering if you could say a bit about how this earlier distinction, I think you made earlier in the literature, between being responsible and further conditions for applying blame to be appropriate, how much that plays a role in your putting being responsible as requiring less of a strong self than autonomy.
Good. Yeah, and the 4-case argument, I think, though I think I've said different things at different points of my career. It's such a great thought experiment. But I believe that in case 1, no responsibility. It's not the agent's own mechanism. In cases 2, 3, and 4, responsibility. It is the agent's own reasons responsive mechanism. Blameworthiness, responsibility is the gateway to activities such as praise and blame, and notions like praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. So that's a different set of issues. And that has to do, and it's a messier, less easy to theorize in an elegant way set of issues. But I think difficulty has something to do with blameworthiness. So when it's really difficult because of your past, maybe genetics, past experiences, upbringing, relationships to primary care, it's extremely difficult to do other than make some horrible, cruel remark or something. You may be responsible, but not significantly blameworthy. So nowadays, as you know, there's a lot of interest in blame and blameworthiness, and there's a whole wonderful literature on it. And the way I look at it, it's kind of getting rid of the middleman. They're not focused on responsibility so much, but directly blameworthiness. So I think being blameworthy entails being responsible, but obviously not vice versa. I think of responsibility as a all or nothing thing, and blameworthiness, praiseworthiness, etc., as scalar. But I find that those are just the most natural ways of thinking about these things, given the way we use the terms. But I don't think anything big hangs on it. I think I could look at responsibility as scalar and just, mutatis mutandis, make the same points. Anyway, Robin, maybe you disappeared. I don't see you anymore. Maybe you had to do that thing. But anyway, thank you for the question. Oh, there you are. There you are. Okay. I hope that helps. But I do, yes.
Yeah, thanks.
So even
I'm sorry to run, but thank you. That's great.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the great talk. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Okay, so Martin, you're up.
Thanks, John, for letting me know about this. This is Polly, by the way. She very much enjoys Zoom meetings because it's always quality time. My questions was really the same as Robin's. I was wondering about the connection between blameworthiness and responsibility and autonomy, specifically because blameworthiness has more of a normative flavor, and whereas you describe responsibility more in the metaphysical sense, and I thought, oh, that means it sounds like blameworthiness is more, something closer to autonomy. But at the same time, you connect moral responsibility with reactive attitudes, and blameworthiness is very much connected to that. However, reactive attitudes have valence, right? I mean, you feel shame or guilt or some negative emotion or positive emotion, gratitude, right? And also in the manipulation cases, you do distinguish between Plum being responsible for killing versus Plum being blameworthy for killing.
Mhm.
And that makes me a little nervous because then we have, it sounds like we're going to have to make 3 different judgments, right? Was it responsible? Is he blameworthy? And is he autonomous? And
Well,
I lose track of the right. So I don't know if you could say, I mean, it's a little in the same ballpark as Robbins, but yeah.
to me, like I say, moral responsibility, it actually requires an epistemic condition being met and a freedom condition. The freedom condition is guidance control, owned reasons responsiveness, but the responsiveness has to include the capacity to grasp and respond appropriately to moral reasons, not just cues. An animal is information sensitive and can, of course, respond to perturbations in its environment, cues, but only human beings or only persons can grasp reasons qua reasons and respond to them. So in a sense, it's a normative notion, and it's also the gateway to the reactive attitudes, or in a different way of speaking, it makes it appropriate, or it renders the individual an apt target of moral predicates, or so it's the gateway to morality, you could say, or being part of the moral community. But autonomy then is an ideal that some moral agents can reach and others not. One way of thinking about it, as far as I'm concerned, is moral responsibility is a status, basically. You could even say a given status. Now, autonomy is an ideal that you can strive for. You don't strive for moral responsibility, you can strive for autonomy. It's an ideal. So it's kind of what a responsible agent might be able to aspire to and might be admirable for doing so. Let me just say, there's a notion of moral responsibility in the role responsibility sense, like, that father was irresponsible, or, that dean was not responsible because they didn't do their duties as dean. And you can aspire to be more responsible in that sense, but you either are or aren't, I think, the kind of entity or creature that has this capacity for moral, for reasons responsible. Okay, I'll stop there and there are a couple more people, but thank you, Martin, and you have a very pretty, cute dog there.
There's another dog, Greg. I should get my dog, it seems. It's gonna be like a dog philosophical dog meeting here shortly. I'll keep mine here on the side. But Greg, so you're up.
Hi, John. Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting.
Thank you for coming.
And maybe this is also following up on some previous questions, particularly Ravisa's question. So I guess I've been having a hard time trying to understand this new taxonomy and think of it in terms of how I think of this taxonomy. So for you, autonomy requires more than moral responsibility. It's a more robust notion. And I guess for me, it would be the opposite, right? That autonomy is a much weaker notion, and that we could have degrees of autonomy. And part of my reasoning for thinking that would be the right way to think of it is common usage, and to think about how we use autonomy speak. We use autonomy speak in terms of cases like medical ethics, like you already talked about, and I'll come to your case in a moment. We talk about degrees of autonomy in terms of abilities between children and slightly older children, and as we gain degrees of autonomy, it's about different degrees of control. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to decide, is there a way to adjudicate which of our taxonomies is the right taxonomy? And so one thing I've kind of discovered in the Q&A part of this is that you're using autonomy as a kind of synonym for free will. Or at least you're giving it this more stringent set of conditions that are required. And for you, it's not just guidance control, it might also require leeway control or something more. And for me, I would then differentiate autonomy from free will. But I think that autonomy is an independent notion. And now you drop the free will talk and you're talking about autonomy.
I don't
if you go back to the medical ethics case, I think there's something slightly misleading in that. So you said the individual what really matters is authenticity in that case. That if this is reflective of what they really want, it doesn't matter whether they satisfy the conditions for autonomy. I don't think that's completely correct, in that I don't think you could have authenticity without autonomy in this case. Imagine a case where someone is forced to make a decision about a DNR, or that there's some external constraint or incapacity in their mental abilities where they're not quite competent enough, but somehow the decision still is consistent with their deep values. Well, it satisfies authenticity, but it doesn't satisfy autonomy. And I think that what we would care about most in this case is, well, I don't know about what most, but I think we care about autonomy. Well, my concept of autonomy is less stringent, in that it really satisfies just conditions of kind of compatibilistic, concerns of, even what you might call reasons responsiveness. So what I'm wondering is how do we adjudicate between your use of autonomy? Is it just a stipulative version of your taxonomy, or can this less stringent notion of autonomy be defended, in which case then more responsibility is more stringent than autonomy?
Okay. You asked a bunch, and so let me just say first, I do not use autonomy as interchangeable with or synonymous with free will. I think of free will as just an umbrella term. In different contexts, it refers to different kinds of freedom, sometimes freedom to do otherwise, sometimes acting freely, sometimes something different, freedom to will otherwise. But you just have to be clear when you use that term in a particular context, what you're talking about. I almost never use the term free will. And I remember recently Al Mealy asked me, what do I mean by free will exactly? But I did notice that my first book was called The Metaphysics of Free Will. But apart from that, in the book, I never actually defined free will. But I don't use the kind of freedom required for moral responsibility is guidance control, on my view. And I agree there are a lot of problems with it, and people have raised legitimate worries, but that's what, for me, free will is, in that it is the freedom required for moral responsibility. And other than that, you asked so many questions that I'm going to need to think more about them. But I agree that part of what I'm doing is trying to map out a structure of ideas. And the terminology may not be that important, though I do want to put my finger on something that is part of what we ordinarily mean when we use the terms, like authenticity. That's the real Greg. or that's really great. That's not quite the same as saying that's the ideal, Greg, or well, let me just stop there. I don't use autonomy as the same as free will. I think of free will as what's the freedom component of responsibility. Then I want to use that to work toward a structure of ideas where the words aren't that important to me. But I see Gary has his hand up, and I want to make sure he gets a chance. So thank you, Greg. You
Gary,
can put me
please.
on email.
You're on deck, Gary, and the floor is yours, and you'll be the last question. So thank you for asking it. It's great. There we go.
Okay, got it. Well, hi everyone, and hi John and everyone else.
Thank you for coming.
This is a question about authenticity too, which is a little perhaps unfair since you admit that you have the less grasp of that. But it's a fascinating idea, and I'm just not too clear how you think about the relation between, in particular, between authenticity and autonomy. I know you think that autonomy involves an idea of ideal self, and authenticity doesn't or needn't. And is it by the ideal? Does the ideal self, if you act on an ideal self, does it entail that you act on your real self, or does it meet it in I take that the idea of autonomy involves these two conditions, internality and non-dominance, or something like that.
Yes.
And so does act, if you act on your ideal self, whatever that means exactly, does that entail that you act on your real self? I mean, it must, I guess, and if it's autonomous. But
so I think you could, first of all, you can act from your internal self, and thus be morally responsible, but that might not be your ideal self. But you might not be authentic because you don't exhibit any coherent, recognizable pattern over time. So, you could be morally responsible for helping at for volunteering to help people get their COVID shots. I think my first shot was from someone who was not trained, but just from a volunteer. So that wasn't pleasant, but you volunteer, but then the next day, instead of helping, you go to a very expensive restaurant. And then the next day, you think of, you're really concerned about your health. So you try and work out because you ate gluttonously, but then the next day you start smoking cigarettes or whatever. And all of those are from appropriately your own reasons, responsive mechanisms. So you're morally responsible, but there's no coherent pattern. I don't know who the authentic Gary is. So it has to be a pattern. Now, if you're acting from your ideal self in a particular case, but then you're weak-willed often and not reliable in your action from your real self, then again, I don't know that we know what your authentic self is. So what I thought, and just really provisional thinking, is that you don't want to, who John really is not necessarily his ideal self. That's, the psychiatrists often refer to it as your ego ideal. you're a wannabe so-and-so. That doesn't mean you are. But if you don't exhibit a kind of pattern over time in your morally responsible action, I don't know that we know who the authentic individual is. That's the way I thought of it. But ideal, you can act from your ideal self, but again, not always, or not typically, or off and on. Anyway, did that help?
Well, I don't know. It seems really complicated to me. For one thing, maybe this is an unwanted connotation of the term, but if you act from your ideal self in a way it's kind of a one-off or uncharacteristic, but it's still, it's, as it were, sincere, on that occasion, and that is, it's your real motive or something like that. You rise to the occasion. Then that wouldn't be a general pattern or something, but that would be, it might be admirable. But if you act contrary to your ideal self, then, if you act authentically, I mean, in that case, then when you act contrary to your ideal self uncharacteristically, then it sounds as though you would be acting not authentically. But saying that seems like the wrong thing to say, because it sounds like you're inauthentic or phony or something like that. But so inauthenticity is a vice of some kind, but maybe you don't want that connotation of the term.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering about that. It's not a very well-formed question. I'm just trying to
no, I see.
Yeah.
David's question and yours are good challenges. Inauthentic action, let's say authentic action is commendable. Being authentic is a virtue. So acting in a particular case in accordance with your ideal self, that's admirable. That's a plus on your moral ledger. But it doesn't necessarily show the authentic you. Let's say I don't know if maybe I forgot exactly what your question is, but let's say you you regularly lie to your best friend or your spouse or your partner. Quite often you lie, but on this occasion, and you don't think that's defensible. You don't think that's not part of your ideal self. But tonight you tell the truth. That's commendable, but it's not who you really are. Even though you might say that, your spouse might say, "Hey, you're often, you lie all the time. So what? You told the truth today." You might say, "But this is who I really am," and your partner's probably going to say, "No, it's not who you really are." Good for you. You didn't lie tonight, but anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, but my intuition is that who you really are is in part a matter of a pattern. And if you don't, a temporally extended pattern. But I don't know though, Gary,
yeah. I'm not sure that's the idea of, I'm not sure if authenticity is, the idea you want here, but, and anyway, that's another question. That's the best term.
I'm going to have to think more about it. And because you're right, authenticity does seem to be a kind of sincerity, or have that as a component. But but I also think it's when you're acting authentically, it's appropriate to say, that's really Gary, that's the real Gary. And it would be, and David suggests that maybe that could be justified by something deep inside you. Maybe, psychoanalysis might not be the only way of discovering, but you discover something really deep. And now you're expressing it. Maybe that is authenticity. I'm not sure. Or maybe it's one notion. When I tried to, one of the most salient and perhaps notorious philosophers who invoke the idea of authenticity is Heidegger. And I tried to read some Heidegger on authenticity, and it didn't help that much. But that's part of this. I've thought in my career more about responsibility and autonomy, but I'd like to think more about authenticity. And I hope, I love systematicity. So I would love it if you could use the same core idea of freedom to analyze these freedom implicating notions, these siblings. And, I also love the idea of using a core notion of guidance control to analyze freedom of action, moral responsibility for action, for omissions, for consequences. I love that idea, but I don't believe I've successfully implemented, because there have been very compelling critiques by Randy Clark and by Carolina Sartorio and others. So I really have to learn from those critiques, but I love that idea. We should be kind of systematic in these ways, or to reach for that kind of systematic approach. And I'm not convinced it can't be done. I'm just convinced I haven't done it yet. Do you want to follow up?
Well, just very quickly, I just wanted to ask whether you think that integrity is something that might connect with your idea of authenticity.
Good.
Because integrity does seem to imply something more one-off, or something more patterned or something like that.
Yeah, very good. That's a good suggestion. That you put it nicely. It might be that I'm really thinking of integrity, or it might be that integrity is a part or necessary for authenticity. On my view, it's something I'd like to think about more. And but thank you for all of these questions. Which, my hope was that I'd get feedback and further thinking about this, and I certainly have. So.
John, like I said, it was a real honor to have you here. I'm so excited. So many people came. The questions were great. Those of you who didn't ask questions, I'm equally thankful that you were here. Hopefully you got something out of it. The next thing will be Corey Clark. She'll be here in, I guess, another month and a half. She does what I think is the most interesting work on the psychology of philosophy and free will and punishment. So I think that'll be a great talk. So thank you, John, for everything. If you guys have any questions you want to ask, you can ask them over on the blog. I'll put up all this stuff tomorrow. And thanks again for your time, John. Good luck figuring out how to be authentically who you deem yourself to be.
And I'll check out the blog, and especially Greg, I feel like you had a lot of questions and I really didn't answer them. So feel free to.
Good, John, because I have some questions too, but I don't ever ask them because it's weird to jump in the queue and take up more time. So I'll post my questions in the blog too. We can have the discussion there. So thanks again to everybody.
Okay, thank you. So nice to see everyone.
And everyone disappears. The cascading of closing.